All I could think about was using this Ivy League PhD to move up the corporate ladder and become a CEO of one of the largest companies of the world. And I lived in a mansion with an 8-car garage, and I filled that 8-car garage with 8 cars and a Ferrari, 2 BMWs, 2 Mercedes.
Talking 4 hours to the FBI. My wife said, good, check, like my lawyer. She said, my husband did the right thing. We can go home now, right? The FBI said, your husband just confessed to $1 billion a year crime. I have to either arrest him today or he has to become an informant tomorrow. And that's how I became an FBI informant.
So I basically stole my own golden parachute, wrote 5 checks for $9 million, and I went to prison for that fraud. And I had full immunity before that.
There's something you're not telling us.
Why would I hide anything from you guys?
We're going to find out what's going on, Mark.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to be able to share with you. And one of the first questions people often ask me, they say, Mark, where do you live? Well, I live near the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cincinnati Reds, so I usually try not to say that, especially in an area like Pittsburgh. But actually, I live on the Kentucky side of the river in Cincinnati. I live 3 exits from the Creation Museum, 3 exits, 3 miles away, and 27 miles from the Ark experience. So whenever people come to visit us at our home in Florence, Kentucky, with being 3 miles from the Creation Museum and 27 miles from the Ark, what an opportunity it is for an outreach experience to plant seeds about God by taking them to those 2 locations. And so we're blessed to live there, and grew up in Cincinnati. My wife and I have lived in the Kentucky side for about 7 years. The actual Cincinnati, Ohio airport is actually in Kentucky, not in Cincinnati, and I travel quite a bit, so it's more convenient to be on the Kentucky side. But we grew up on the Cincinnati side, north of Cincinnati, near Kings Island is where we grew up, and my mom still lives there. My mom still lives there today in that area. But the questions that we're going to be talking about today are the following. Is our work important to God? Do you think God cares about our work? Is it important? We're going to be talking about that. What does God say about our work? Specifically, we're going to be sharing a little bit about that today. And what does an effective servant leader or an ambassador for Christ look like? Think about that. What does an effective servant leader look like, an ambassador for Christ? And boy, I lived the opposite. When I was 32 years old, that was 5 years ago, by the way, when I was 32 years old. That was 30 years ago. I'm 62 years old now, but 30 years ago, I was a selfish leader. So I learned what a servant leader was by guys that have reached out to me and discipled me and poured into me. And I learned to become a servant leader through others. But prior to that, I was a selfish leader. And I can tell you one thing for sure, and for certain. If you're not a servant leader, you're a selfish leader. And I was one of those. And I was one of those for 15 or 20 years in the business world before I got to know God. And I want to share that. I thank God every day for sending 2 ambassadors for Christ into my life, because it impacted my life and changed my life forever. At about age 40, when God sent 2 ambassadors, 2 servant leaders to pour into me. And I want to share a little bit about that story. As I mentioned, I grew up in Cincinnati area. My wife and I went to Ohio State University. Then I went to Cornell University for my PhD in biochemistry. After that, 8 years of college, scholarship for those 8 years of college. During that time, I was the only child out of eight children, out of 4 children. I was the only one to go to college at all. And my mom used to say, you went and got a degree for all of them. And the amazing thing is I used that education for the wrong purposes. I used them for selfish reasons. I can remember getting my PhD in an Ivy League school, and I was thinking, 22 years of age, PhD student in biochemistry at Cornell in New York. And I can remember during that time, I was thinking, I'm going to make a lot of money with this degree. I could help me propel me to be a CEO of one of the largest companies in the world. And it's amazing. those things did happen, but how empty they were when I got there. And I'm going to share that. I'm going to share that journey. When I was 32 years of age, this was 7 years after I finished my PhD at Cornell. When I was 32 years of age, I was divisional president of a company called ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, one of the largest companies in the world out of Decatur, Illinois, 30,000 employees, $70 billion in U.S. revenue, the 56th largest company in America, and the 90th largest company in the world then in 1989, and even larger than that today. I think they're the 48th largest company in America today. When you go to the grocery store, it would be difficult for you to buy a food or beverage that does not have something from ADM in it. If you buy a Kellogg cereal, it's got ingredients from Archer Daniels Midland. If you buy a Coca-Cola or Pepsi, most of what's in Coca-Cola and Pepsi is produced by ADM, except the water in the can. If you buy a Pillsbury or a Kraft or an orange juice or an iced tea, all those ingredients have, all those foods have ingredients from Archer Daniels Midland in that ADM, one of the largest food additive companies in the world. They touch the world with hundreds of manufacturing plants around the world. Now, my first week there, I'm 32 years old. It's October of 1989, and I was divisional president of the biotech division. The company had a CEO, a vice chairman, a president, and 4 divisional presidents. So that made up the 7 top executives out of 30,000 employees. Our CEO was 75 years old, our president was 69, and I was divisional president at age 32. I can simply say it this way: I was Justin Bieber before Justin Bieber. I had blonde hair blowing in the wind and the whole bit during that time. And I can remember my first week at work, the CEO told me the 7 top executives each get their own jet. So I had a Falcon 50 corporate jet given to me my first week at work, October 89, at 32 years of age. I said, "Look out, Bon Jovi, here I come." And then, so I had this corporate jet flying around, really thinking I'm all it, and narcissism was really starting to set in. And then the CEO asked me if I moved my family yet from Frankfurt, West Germany, where my wife and our children lived at that time for 4 years. Our children were in the German school. And we were pretty much entrenched into the European lifestyle. And I wasn't a Christian during this time. And he asked me if I moved my family to Decatur, Illinois yet. And I said, well, I've only been here about 3 weeks, but we're looking at homes and buying homes and so on. And to move my family in December when it was a better break in the school year in December than it would have been in October. And I ended up buying the home that the CEO lived in for 30 years. The original founder of Archer Daniels Midland, 115 years earlier, John Daniels of Archer Daniels Midland, built this home. And it was a 13,000 square foot home, 8-car garage, horse riding stables where your kids could ride in a warm, comfortable inside arena when it's wintertime outside in Decatur, Illinois. And that's the home we lived in, 15 acres, a mansion. Well, what's a 32-year-old do that's full of himself with an 8-car garage? You fill it up. So I had a Ferrari, 2 BMWs, 2 Mercedeses. My salary, the 7.5 years, almost 8 years that I was at ADM at age 32, and this is 30 years ago, was 7 figures every year. And that doesn't include any of the shenanigans or illegal activity. I'm just talking about legal salary in the 7 figures during that time, 30 years ago. And I started thinking I deserved that. I was obsessed with that. I've never had a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, but I've had an addiction. And I was addicted to greed. And I was addicted to materialism. And I couldn't, once I got a Ferrari, 2 weeks later, I'm thinking, what's next? What's next? Then I got a big 13,000 square foot home with an 8-car garage, and I'm thinking a couple weeks later, what's next? What's next? Flying around on a Falcon 50. I can tell you, if you're living your life for materialism and title and compensation and greed, it will never end. I could have got to the level of Bill Gates, I believe, and it would not been enough. Every 2 or 3 weeks after the next big trophy that I brought home, it's what's next, what's next. Well, I was sharing with my wife, Ginger, and as I mentioned to you, I met my wife, Ginger, when she was in 7th grade and in 8th grade when we first met. This is a picture of us in high school. We went to our high school proms together. And I was senior class president. She was treasurer of her class. We were gifted students in this little Miami high school about 45 minutes north of Cincinnati. And we've been married 40 years as of last month, 40 years. And I know that may not mean a lot to you right now, but by the end of this journey that I share with you, for my wife to stay with me is a miracle of God. It's a miracle of God. And I think you will agree and say the same thing when we're finished here with this journey here today. So Ginger started, as I started getting obsessed with the cars and the planes and the title. And here I am, 32 years old, and the CEO, as I mentioned, 75, and the president, 69. You would think being number 4 executive, you would be satisfied. I'm already thinking, well, when are these guys going to retire? When are they going to get out of my way? I don't want to be divisional president. I want to be the company president. And that's what I was already thinking. I mean, within a month or two after starting that job, I'm already thinking, what's next? What's next? Just like I did in the area with the materialisms. But during that time, as I'm driving 8 cars in our garage, Ginger's driving a 10-year-old Wrangler Jeep. She grew up on a beef cattle farm. All this stuff didn't matter to her. Matter of fact, she would tell me often, get these cars out of the driveway and get them in the garage. It embarrassed her, them sitting in the driveway. She said, you think you're Magnum P.I.? I think I actually thought I was Magnum P.I. during that time. My car was just like his, the red car with the black snap-off top and so on. So during that time when I was a greed addiction, she was starting to have an obsession with Jesus. She became a Christian about a decade before me. She was involved in women's Bible studies. Now, I went to church. My parents, Christians, forced me to go to church, but it was one ear out the other. Maybe had God a little bit in my head, but I definitely did not have him in my heart. I went to church with my wife and our 3 children during this time, and also maybe God in my head, but not God in my heart. It was just one ear out the other. I would have thought being a Christian then was like joining a club. If you go to church, you're a Christian. Well, that's just like saying you put an apple in the garage, it's a car. And I was not a Christian, that's for sure, but Ginger was. And it was meaning something to her, and she got Jesus in her heart. And she sat me down one time. We're 3 years with the company. It's November 1992, and she says, Mark, what's going on with your life? And I said, Ginger, we got a corporate jet. We live in a mansion. Our kids go to private schools, high schools that cost like what Harvard costs. Culver Military Academy, our daughter went to in Culver, Indiana. Brim Prep School, our middle son went to in Carbondale, Illinois. These are $30,000 or $40,000 a year then, back in the 80s per year schools. I said, our kids go to the best schools. I said, if there's a heaven, Ginger, this is it. And she said, I can tell you, Mark, this is not heaven. Matter of fact, it's the opposite. She said, I think Satan's got a hold of you and you've got an addiction. I said, addiction, Ginger, like I told you earlier, I said, all of you earlier, I've never used drugs and alcohol in my life. What do you mean an addiction? She said, Mark, you work the minute you get up till the minute you go to bed, the 3 years you've been at ADM so far. I said, Ginger, I have to work like that. 90% of my compensation is in stock options and bonuses based on performance. So I have to meet certain performance parameters. The more I work, the more I earn. And that's why we live like this. And she said, you know what, Mark? I'd rather have 2 Fords in the driveway, a 2,000 square foot house, and have my husband back at home. I've lost my husband in this journey that you have since you joined ADM. And she said, especially the last 7 months, you're not the person I fell in love with in high school. And that was hard to take, to hear that, because you think you're doing so good and you're doing so good for your family because you give them so much materialistically. So it was hard for me to hear that and hard to accept that when she said I wasn't the man she fell in love with in high school. And I said, well, tell me more about that. She said, Mark, the last 7 months, I'm 3 years at ADM now. She said, the last 7 months, you get on the phone when you come home from work and you're on the phone 3, 4, 5 hours a night. You may have dinner with the family, but by the time you're off the phone, everybody's in bed. She said, what's going on these last 7 months? And so I started sharing with the girl that I met when she was in 7th grade and who I fell in love with in high school. And I started sharing with her. I said, well, Ginger, the CEO is now 78. Keep in mind, he was 75 when I joined. This is 3 years later at the company. I said, he's 78 years old, heading towards 80. The president's now 72. So the 2 top executives are 70s and heading towards their 80s. And so now they're mentoring us and pouring into some couple younger guys to be able to take their place. And they're showing us how ADM does business. And she says, well, what do you mean? How does ADM do business? I said, well, basically, they have an international cartel, and she's a stay-at-home mom raising 3 young kids, so she didn't even know what some of these things were. And I said, they're fixing the prices of the food additives that go into all of your foods. And I said, they earn an extra $1 billion a year. hundreds of millions of dollars by doing this price fixing scheme, and they've been doing it for well over a decade. She said, Mark, is this legal? I said, Ginger, it's not legal, but everybody does it. They told me in the commodity business, if you want to be in a commodity business, you have to do this. This is the way business is done. And Ginger, I joined ADM 7 years out of college. They've been there 30, 40 years. They know a lot more than I do. This is the real world, how business is done. She said, well, who pays this? Hundreds of millions of dollars, almost $1 billion a year. Who pays for that the company earns extra through this price fixing scheme? I said, well, basically the consumers pay it. Because when Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Kraft, when they pay higher for their ingredients, they have a profit margin built in. They pass it to the consumer. So the consumers are paying for that. I said, maybe $50 for the groceries, maybe $4 or $5, that's it, extra. Every consumer around the world paying maybe $4 or $5. That's it. She said, you mean my grandma on $200 a week Social Security is paying for this? And we live in a mansion with an 8-car garage? She said, Mark, I don't know if I can live with this. I said, Ginger, if I'm going to continue to move up in this company and maintain this job that I have and the standard of living that our family has, I have to keep doing this. This is what I have to do. And then she said something I never wanted to hear. She said she was going to go back in her study and pray about it, and we talk about it later. I knew then I was in trouble. She came back a couple hours later, and I was thinking, good, now you got it behind you. We can go back to work and do what I need to do. And she said, well, Mark, I've been praying about it, and you're involved with 7 months, something that's been going on for almost 12 years. You've only been at the company for 3 years. What a perfect time to turn yourself into the authorities. I said, Ginger, that would be the craziest thing ever. Turn myself in, I could go to prison. Federal prison for price fixing. It's breaking antitrust laws. There's laws against that. I said, the CEO is best friends of President Clinton. He picks up the phone and talks to President Clinton on a regular basis. He flew to President Nixon's funeral on President Clinton's plane. I said, this CEO is a billionaire. They will come after us with everything they have. He's 78-year-old, and he has the largest shareholder of ADM, and he's got resources in the billions, and they will kill us, honey. We couldn't survive this. She said, you know what? My CEO is bigger than your CEO. My CEO's God. And then I knew I was in trouble. So she said, Mark, God led her to a decision, and you're going to turn yourself in today, or I'm going to do it for you. And I mean it. And I tried for a couple hours to talk her out of it, a case that was going on for 12 years. And a stay-at-home mom raising 3 young kids blew the lid off that case that was going on over a decade, that was a theft of over $1 billion a year for 12 years in a row. I said, Ginger, we could become homeless. She said, you know what, Mark? I'd rather be homeless than live in a house with illegal activity. We're going to do this, and we're going to do it today. I've got the number. We're calling them. There's no choice about it. You are meeting with the FBI today. So after spending a couple hours trying to talk her out of it, we're sitting 4 hours with the FBI. I don't know how many of you ever went and told the FBI you're stealing $1 billion a year, but I can tell you it's an interesting reaction. I can tell you firsthand. The phone reached Janet Reno, Attorney General, Louis Freeh, the director of the FBI. This became the largest price-fixing, white-collar case in U.S. history, started by my wife, Ginger, that didn't even work at ADM. It proved in a 7-week trial that over 100 people knew about it, started by my wife, Ginger, who didn't even work at ADM. So at the end of 4 hours, we were young and naive in our early 30s. We didn't have any lawyers with us or anything like that. And I mentioned to Ginger, or Ginger mentioned to I remember first thing talking to the FBI, and the FBI said, the big mistake that I had Ginger with me, let me describe. The FBI saying, now, tell me a little more about this case. I said, well, it's really not that big. Ginger said, it's $1 billion a year. He said, how much? $1 billion a year, she said. I said, well, maybe not that big. He told me for 2 hours, it's $1 billion. He said, how long has it been going on? I said, really not that long. It's been going on for 12 years, she said. He said, been telling me for 2 hours, it's been going for 12 years. He should have just interviewed Ginger and left me out of it. So at the end of the 4 hours, Ginger acted like my lawyer, and she said, now, look, my husband did the right thing. He's only involved 7 months. He's just doing what he was told to do. He didn't invent this system. He didn't invent the price fixing. It was going on 9 years before he even joined the company. He's only been there 3 years and only involved with the crime for 7 months. So we can go home now, right? The FBI said, your husband can't go home. He just admitted to a $1 billion theft that's going on for over a decade. We either have to arrest him today or he has to become an informant tomorrow to go after the kingpins of the case. And he has to wear a wire and he has to help us solve this case. That's his choice. Be arrested or wear a wire. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the difference between an informant and a whistleblower. A whistleblower is someone who sacrifices everything to do the right thing. That's Ginger. An informant is someone sitting in front of the FBI and you have a choice to either get arrested or start wearing a wire. And that was me. I was the informant and she was the whistleblower in that case. So I met the FBI agents. They said only wear a wire about 6 weeks. It'll go quick. It won't take long. I met the FBI agents, 4 of them, 6 o'clock the next morning. They shaved my chest, put microphones to my chest, put an athletic band around my waist with a tape recorder that was hooked to the 2 microphones, a tape recorder on my back, another tape recorder in a briefcase, and another tape recorder in a notebook. 3 different tape recorders. And they said only about 6 weeks. I met those 4 FBI agents 6 every morning for 3 years. For 3 years, from age 35 to age 38, 1992 to 1995. I wore a wire 10 hours a day, every day for 3 years. Longest duration in history of anybody to ever wear a wire. I've done 7 events for the FBI, including Guanaco FBI Academy. And you don't want to break that record either, by the way. Don't try to break that record. The amazing thing is, as I'm wearing this wire every day, the FBI knew they were going up against one of the biggest companies in the world, and they wanted to show a jury what was going on. They knew ADM could spend millions and tens of millions on lawyers. This was a 7-week trial. Dozens of lawyers involved in Chicago during the mid-90s when they had enough evidence to prosecute the case. And so therefore, when I was wearing a wire, the fact they wanted to show the jury what was going on, they had a green lamp that looks like it came from a yard sale. That's the actual green lamp that you're looking at. The video camera was in that green lamp. So when there were sometimes at these price fix meetings, 7 guys, 8 guys, sometimes up to 11 guys from different companies all around the world, international cartel, we would be at the Shangri-La Hotel. 11 guys would be at that meeting in Singapore, Shangri-La Hotel, $1,000 night hotel, and that green lamp had the video camera in it sitting there in that hotel room. $1,000 a night, looked like it came from a yard sale, sitting 5 feet from the 11 guys that are meeting. 2 weeks later, we're at the Mandarin Hotel in Hong Kong, same 11 guys, that green lamp's sitting 5 feet from us. 4 weeks after that, we're in the Four Seasons Hotel in Chicago, same 11 guys, sitting 5 feet from us is that green lamp. That green lamp was at 3 or 4 meetings a month, every month for 3 years with the same 11 guys, 5 feet from us. Thank God we didn't have a woman criminal among us. Because if we would have had a woman criminal among us, I'm convinced a woman would have said, that green lamp is following us around the world. And it was. Until a 7-week trial came about, they got to see that green lamp in front of a jury. Then they remembered seeing it. They remembered seeing it all those times. And the video camera was in that. So at the end of 3 years wearing a wire, the FBI gave me a deal of a lifetime. 6 months. The others were going to go to prison for years. 30 people went to prison. 4 people from Archer Daniels Midland alone. They were going to give me a 6-month plea agreement. They had a plea agreement signed for 6 months. My lawyer calls me in Chicago with my wife. We come down to Chicago. The lawyer says, Mark, 6-month plea agreement, a Martha Stewart sentence. Deal of a lifetime. No fence, no wires, no razor wire, white collar camp. This is a deal of a lifetime, Mark. Sign it. And then Ginger looked at me and she said, Mark, I'm begging you to sign this. Let's put it behind us. You go to prison here in March, you'll be out in 6 months. I said, Ginger, you're the one that got me in this mess in the first place. I ripped up that plea agreement in front of her and said, I'm going to do the opposite you want me to do. I fired that lawyer on the spot, who's a judge now. And I threw that away and hired a whole group of lawyers the next day and fought the case for 3 years in the courts and got a 10-year sentence instead. And I had a 6-month plea agreement right in front of me. I showed Ginger, didn't I? I was my own worst enemy every step of the way. The FBI were trying to help me, and I was cutting their legs out from under them. I couldn't imagine going to prison for 8.5 years. There's no parole in the federal system, no parole. You get 15% off good behavior. So you have to do 8.5 years on a 10-year sentence. So now I have to do 8.5 years, and I would have done 6 months. I couldn't imagine surviving it. I wrote a 17-page letter to Ginger and my 3 children, pulled my car in one of those garages, and I tried to kill myself. I couldn't imagine going to prison from age 40 to age 49. I couldn't imagine. Tried to take my own life. I wanted to die. There's no doubt about it. I wanted to die more than anything during that time. I said, I can't survive 9 years in prison. Well, that's where the movie The Informant ended, about all the ADM executives, including myself, going to prison. That's Ginger and I with my identical twin, Matt Damon. I think you can see why they chose Matt Damon. I'm the one on the right, by the way, if you wonder which one I am. And there's several books, 3 books written on the case, documentaries. The FBI was so upset that the movie was a comedy because it was a pretty serious story that included even suicide attempt. And the FBI was so upset that it was a comedy, they did a documentary 6 months later called Undercover, that's on Discovery Channel. And that's on my website, markwhitacre.com, that documentary. When you watch that with the 4 real FBI agents involved and Ginger and I all 20 years later talking about this case, it's a whole different story than the Hollywood version. But either way, the movie wasn't interested in the faith journey. They weren't interested in the last 25 years. They wanted a crime drama. The director's an atheist, and he said he wants a crime drama and he wants to end with everybody in prison. He wasn't looking for a redemption story. So it's a crime drama, and it ends with everybody going to prison, which we greatly deserve. There's no doubt about it. We probably deserved even more time than what we got. So the movie ends going to prison 21 years ago, 1998, when I went to prison. Did life end when I went to prison? I thought it was. The divorce rate, if you go to prison, by the way, is 78%, the divorce rate. 78%. If you serve 5 years and longer, the official statistic is 99%. If you serve 5 years longer, I did 8.5 years. It's a miracle of God that I'm married 40 years. Divorce rate is 99% if you serve 5 years and longer. So someone was reading about this in the newspaper a few months before I went to prison, right after I attempted suicide. I was hospitalized a month with a suicide attempt, treated for post-traumatic stress disorder, some things that happen when you wear a wire every day for 3 years. The FBI don't even allow someone to wear a wire longer than a year because of what happened in my case. The maximum is a year now. They don't even allow 3 years. At the end of 3 years, you don't know who you work for. The FBI, ADM, you're totally confused wearing a wire 10 hours a day for 3 years. So I was hospitalized, sent home. I had 7 months to get back on my feet before I had to go to prison for 8.5 years. There was a man that read about it. His name is Ian Howes. Ian Howes is a CFO of a pharmaceutical company. This would have been 1997, 22 years ago. He read about me in the newspapers, including the suicide attempt, ripping up the 6-month plea agreement, all of those things. He's with a group called CBMC, Christian Businessmen Connection, in addition to being CFO of a pharmaceutical company. And he showed up on my porch, stranger to me, I didn't know him. And my wife said someone to talk to me, and I went out a month after I tried to take my own life, 7 months before I leave for prison for 8.5 years. And he said, Mark, prison is going to be the beginning of your life, and you're going to find your true purpose in life with the journey you're ready to start. I went back in the kitchen with Ginger. I said, Ginger, there's somebody in the porch that's crazier than I am. She said, that can't be. First thing she said. And then I said, he said, prison's going to be the beginning of my life, and I'm going to find my true purpose in life with the journey I'm ready to start. She fell to her knees, and in tears she said, thank God. God sent somebody. She said, Mark, I've been praying for you for 10 years. For 10 years I've been praying for you, and your parents have been praying for you for decades. And you haven't listened to us, and I pray you go out and listen to this man, because God sent him. And I went out, seeing how it meant so much to Ginger, only for that reason. I went out and I said, Ian, what do you have in mind? He said, Mark, I'm going to introduce you to Jesus. I said, Ian, I've been going to church my whole life. He said, I'm not talking about just going to church, Mark. You may have God in your head, but I'm talking about introduce you to Jesus, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And he said he had a study called Operation Timothy that introduces me to Jesus. So he normally met with somebody an hour a week, but in this case, he had to meet about 6, 7 hours a week because it's usually a couple-year process, and I'm leaving for prison in 7 months. So he spent 6, 7 hours a week with me, a man that had 5 children school age and younger, his wife an attorney, and he spent him CFO of a company, 6, 7, 8 hours a week with me. And then 7 months, he planted a seed where for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to take my own life. I started having some hope. I wasn't there yet, but I started having some hope. 7 months after that, my second week in prison, this man shows up. His name is Chuck Colson. I don't know how many of you know who Chuck Colson is, but he was the White House counsel under President Nixon in the 70s. And he got caught up in that Watergate scandal, had an office next to the Oval Office when he was in his 30s, and he was in prison at age 40 for the Watergate scandal. President Nixon would have went to prison also, but he was pardoned by President Ford, so he didn't go to prison. So Chuck Colson went to prison. It was the second week when he came to visit me. He went to prison in the 70s. This would have been 1998. And he visited me in the visiting room, my second week in prison, and he said, Mark, this is going to be the beginning of your life. I said, that's what Ian Howe's been telling me for 7 months. He said, Mark, have you surrendered your life to Jesus yet? And I said, I haven't yet. I learned 8 years in college. I said, Chuck, I've learned 8 years in college that as a scientist, you can't be a scientist and believe in God. I've even had professors at Cornell said, if you believe in God, you can't be a scientist. The Big Bang Theory and evolution and Darwinism. All I learned for 8 years of college as a scientist, there is no God. And I said, that's a block for me after those 8 years of college. He said, Mark, you don't think there's a scientist that believes in God? I said, Chuck, I don't think there is. He started burying me with article after article. First, when he sent me to Albert Einstein, said the Big Bang Theory is impossible. Only God could create man in the universe. I said, well, Albert Einstein's a pretty smart guy. And then he started sending me article after article and book after book of scientists that believed in God. After 3 months of reading those books, I got down on my knees on June 4th, 1998 at age 41 and surrendered my life to Jesus. In a concrete floor, a locker, and a roommate. After a 13,000 square foot house for 8 years, I was 8.5 years and a 10 by 10, a concrete floor, a locker, and a roommate. And $20 a month, not 7 figures. And I surrendered my life to Jesus, and the most productive years of my life happened after that. I actually became a free man in prison. And I was in prison to that life of greed before I went to prison. That addiction of greed, the way the world defines success. Well, what do these two men have in common? Chuck Colson and Ian Howe. What do they have in common? Well, they both see the workplace as no better place for ministry than the marketplace, to right where God has us. I mean, it's great to be missionaries, go around where I got missionary friends and I love them and I respect them. But we're all missionaries. No matter where you work, we're all missionaries. And we're all in a location that we can reach others that don't know God, and we can plant seeds. And Chuck and Ian Howe saw that. As ambassadors for Christ and as servant leaders, they saw that there's no better mission field than the workplace and the marketplace. Well, why is that the case? Because God says so. What does God say about our work, for example? Well, here's what God says about our work. What did he do when he created man, when he created Adam? The first thing God did when he created Adam, he put him in the Garden of Eden and put him to work. And when he created Eve, he put her in the Garden of Eden. God is showing us in Genesis even 2:15 that there's no better place for ministry than work. And work's important to God because that's the first place he put Adam, was he put him to work. What can we learn from Jesus about the marketplace? What can we learn from Jesus? Did you know in Scripture there's 132 public appearances in Scripture of Jesus? Did you know 122 of them are in the marketplace? 92% of his public appearances were in the marketplace. Jesus shows us by example that there's no better place for ministry than right where God has us, which is where we work. 92%. Now, why would Jesus use the marketplace for ministry? Because that's where the people were. 50% of our waking hours is at work. If you look at the number of hours we're awake, it's about 45% at home, 50% at work, and then less than 5% at church. So that's where the people were. The people that are lost and that don't know about Jesus were at work. What about the 12 disciples? Where did they come from? Did you know all 12 of the disciples came from the marketplace? Fishermen, tax collectors, doctor, every one of them came from the marketplace. When Jesus ascended back to heaven and he told those disciples, go make disciples of all nations, in Matthew 28:19, where did they go back to? The marketplace, to reach the lost and to plant seeds, but to do different at their work than they did before that. So Jesus showed us by example, even with those disciples, no better place for ministry than the workplace. The purpose of our life, I've learned in this 25-year journey, the purpose of our life is in 2 Corinthians 5:20. We are Christ's ambassadors. If you're a Christian, you're an ambassador for Christ. That means I don't care if you're in an Uber car, at a grocery store, at a post office, or at work, that's where God has us, to plant seeds. Just plant the smallest of seeds and then let someone else plant the next one. And God will orchestrate it all. But no matter where we're in life, God will use us as an ambassador for Christ. The only question is that we have to ask ourselves, how effective are we? That's the only question we have to ask. How effective are we? Well, the way to be effective is this. Matthew 28:19, I believe 2 scriptures show you how to be an effective ambassador. Matthew 28:19, which is what this church is all about, go make disciples of all nations. That's one way to be effective. And the other one is 2 Timothy 2:2, where Paul told Timothy, take these things you learned from me and go share with others. That's how you play out your purpose in your life, evangelism and discipleship. And I want to end with that. That's the message that I want to end with. That the purpose of our life is to be a servant leader for Jesus, to be an ambassador for Christ, just like 2 Corinthians 5:20 says. And the way to do that and how to do that is through evangelism and discipleship, no matter where God has you. Thank you very much for having me. What a blessing it is to be there.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for the blessing. Thank you.
I do want to tell you one real quick thing. My wife got asked, she's on CBS News in 2009 when the movie came out, and they asked her in a big interview, CBS on TV, they said, Ginger, how'd you do it? 99% divorce rate, how'd you do it? And she said, God told me to love him even when I didn't love him, to love him unconditionally. She said, divorce wasn't an option, but murder was. Right on TV. Then they asked her, he said, when did you consider murder? When he tore up a 6-month prison sentence, plea agreement, I wanted to kill him. Right on TV. And they said, well, Ginger, what would have happened if your husband signed that 6-month plea agreement? She said, I thought about that a lot over the decades, and I think my husband would have came out the same greedy man he went in. I don't think he would even listen to Chuck Colson and Ian Howes if he had a 6-month sentence. God gave him exactly what he needed, which was 9 years in prison. I think 2 years would have been enough, but I know 6 months would not have been. God bless all of you.